Inga mana, inga reo. Inga tā wira pumanawa, ro rakatirama, tena koto, tena tato katoa. Good evening, everyone. My name is Harlene Hain, and I am the Vice Chancellor here at the University of Otago, and it gives me great pleasure to open this inaugural professorial lecture for Professor Michael Schultz. These lectures are really a time of celebration for us here at the University of Otago, and I'm so happy to see so many people here who have come to support Michael and to celebrate his promotion to professor. On behalf of the university, I'd like to extend a particularly warm welcome to members of Michael's family who are either here in person or joining us virtually through the internet. His wife, Heike, who studied tourism and has a master's degree in entrepreneurship from the University of Otago. His daughter, Kim, graduated in psychology and marketing at Otago and is currently enrolled in a master's in international hotel management in Sydney. And we would like to give a shout out to Kim. Hopefully she's watching us this evening. And last but not least, his daughter Fiona, who is currently a first-year student at Otago, who is enrolled in geology and geography. So as you can see, the Schultz family is very heavily connected to the University of Otago. Now, in addition to these very special family members, as I look out on the audience this evening, I see academic and professional staff members from across the university and students, and most importantly, perhaps, members of the wider Dunedin community. I also understand that there is a large contingent from the German community in Dunedin, so to all of you, Nomai Hedamai, welcome. And after an amazing weekend celebrating our 150th anniversary, I would also like to acknowledge the presence of our Chancellor, Dr. Royden Somerville, who is also here this evening. Thank you very much, Royden, for coming. Now, as all of you have heard me say so many times, the path to professor here at the University of Otago is not an easy one. In order to receive this particular promotion, the applicant must demonstrate excellence in teaching, in research, and in service to the university and the wider community. As you will learn from his lecture this evening, Professor Schultz is an effective and motivating teacher. In fact, the student evaluations of his teaching border on the perfect. He is also an outstanding scientist, and tonight you will have the opportunity to learn more about his groundbreaking research into gut health. And last, but certainly not least, Michael has provided exceptional service to his department, to the university, and to the wider research community. All of this activity is all the more impressive because it has occurred against the backdrop of a very busy medical practice. So, Michael, on behalf of the University of Otago, it gives me great pleasure to congratulate you on your very well-earned promotion to professor. And I will now call on the Dean of the Dunedin School of Medicine, Professor Barry Taylor, who will tell us just a little bit more about Michael's academic journey to professor. Nō reira, tena koto, tena tato katoa.
Kia ora, everybody. Great to see you turn out on a cold night. It's my pleasure to introduce Michael Schultz, Professor Michael Schultz, and I guess summarize in less than 5 minutes his career to date. So Michael was born and spent his first 18 years in Stuttgart in Germany. He then joined the army and spent 18 months in the army. That was pretty standard practice for all young men in Germany at that stage. Then left after 18 months, went to university, studying medicine, graduating in 1994. He then spent his house surgeon years, so the next 2 years, in the UK, Manchester, and then in London, before spending a 2-year stint at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in the USA. After those 2 years, really focusing on research, he then went back to Germany and spent 8 years as a clinical research fellow and then consultant gastroenterologist, and towards the end of that time was awarded his PhD, slightly different name in Germany, but the equivalent to a PhD in 2005. He then came to Dunedin as a joint clinical appointment between the university and the DHB, and functioned as a gastroenterologist within the clinical service and a senior lecturer within the Department of Medicine. He spent 8 years in that role before being promoted to associate professor, and then 6 years after that to the full professorship that we're celebrating tonight. During that time, he took on roles as deputy and then head of Department of Medicine, and he's been in that head of department role now for the last 3 years. He's published greater than 65 peer-reviewed papers, 9 chapters and books, supervised, or currently or in the past, supervised more than 15 masters and PhD students, and all the time maintaining an active role as a clinician in the hospital system. He's a very active researcher. He runs a large number of commercial trials within the hospital system, testing out new ways of managing patients with mainly inflammatory bowel disease, but he'll be talking a lot more about that. But his research has clearly been directed and informed by his patients, and we'll hear a bit more about that. In terms of his collaboration, probably the most noteworthy thing I want to mention is his forming and leading a gut health network of researchers from across the spectrum of research expertise looking at gut health. And gut health has become the big thing in many areas of science, which now seems to control your emotions, your bowel habits, whether you're going to get an inflammatory disease such as even heart disease. So the influence of the gut, well known for a long time in terms of the influence on the brain and vice versa, but now that influence has spread right across the whole body. So being in gut health is a great sort of research opportunity, which he has picked up and run with by forming this gut health network. So that's a quick summary of Michael Schultz. And in becoming a full professor, I'm able to actually sort of show that there's one other sort of name that comes to this. So this is the Mary Glendinning Chair in Medicine. Unfortunately, no money comes with this at all, just the prestige and the name. I think Gil Barbazat and Rob Walker were previous holders of this particular chair. So this is for your office, and not only are you got a full professorship, but you have the Mary Glendinning Chair in Medicine. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Hain and Professor Taylor. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, and thank you very much for all of you to give up your evening to listen to hopefully an interesting story, maybe a not quite straightforward story, but also a story that is the story of my life. And as a professor, you get this one opportunity to tell the story of your life. I think then nobody's really interested in that again, and you have to really focus on your research once more. I brought my lucky colon with me. So this is the colon that is on the poster for the that advertised for the IPL. And I had some people asking me, Michael, what do you have in your hands? Well, now you know it. I've got my lucky colon in my hands, and I put my lucky colon here. So I guess just right beside the Mary Glendinning chair. It's a peculiar chair. I wonder what you do with it. But yes, let's get on to this. I would like to tell you a little bit of a journey of how it came to be that I studied medicine, and a journey that in the end led me to live here in Dunedin. So we've been here now for about 15 years or so, and we still like it. And I introduced the place to a radiologist just the other day, and I think at some point he probably thought, well, can this guy stop talking about Dunedin? We know that he likes it here. So this is the journey that started in Germany, took us to England, as Barry pointed out, then from England over to America, from America back to Germany, and then finally down to New Zealand. It was a bit of a rocky start, I have to say. This is little Michael. maybe I should have become a car mechanic. I don't know. I had great interest in cars that day, and yeah, maybe that should have been my calling. I then went to school in Stuttgart, as you said, Barry, and this is how we looked like when we went to school. So you see the little, they were politically completely incorrect, I think, nowadays, these horns full of sweets. There were no apples in there or anything. This was purely chocolate and sweets and lollies and stuff like that. Grandma possibly was a little bit differently thinking, so she would have given me a ruler and a pen and stuff like, what do I do with that? I like the sweets. So this was that. This is probably the first time I came across something closely resembling anatomy. So this is me working at age 16 in the local abattoir or slaughterhouse. My job was to put stamps on the carcasses, so they were examined before and found ready to be consumed or put into the food chain, so I put the stamp on there. Very interesting job. Looking back, what I struggled with most was the half-liter or liter of beer my colleagues consumed for breakfast. They looked at me and said, "You're drinking not beer?" And the test they performed then to convince me that I should have a beer, and you all know this, take a glass of Coca-Cola, and I'm not advertising, you take a glass of Coke, put a piece of meat in there, it will dissolve. Put it into beer, it will not. So, hey, who can argue that a beer for breakfast isn't something that you should have? I struggled with that, and I still do, probably luckily. A slight detour, I thought, well, shaping surfboards might be something that I should do. Tragic story to that. This thing is now at the bottom of Lago di Garda, the Italian lake. It didn't swim. So that career was nothing for me either. And Barry mentioned the army. So every German young man had to basically join the army. And that time, you could try very hard not to join the army. That was possible, but it would have had some repercussions for your future career, and the traditional Germans wouldn't like that. So I joined the army. It was the path of least resistance. I don't think I look very fearsome there. And I tried to get out of the army as soon as I could. That's why I cut it short by a few months to then study medicine. In fact, I briefly considered studying medicine in the army. That would have allowed me to stay in the army for another 30 years or so. They would have paid for studies. That was all good. What really I didn't like, apart from other things not liking the army, was they would have told me what I have to do. They wouldn't have let you use your specialty or choose your specialty that you liked. They would have said, well, we do need an orthopedic surgeon. I don't think I would have made a good orthopedic surgeon or a psychiatrist for that matter. So that was really something. Luckily, the public system called and I was able to get away and study medicine. That's I did in Erlangen-Nuremberg. We don't have the freshest 5 or the freshest 10 or whatever you call this here, but we have student fraternities. The reason to be in a fraternity is the same. You make friends and you drink. That's basically all you do for the first year. You do this wearing fancy uniforms and you have a lot of traditions, and that's why I joined them. I really felt at home there. They gave you kind of a home away from home. Looking back, it looks funny. I'm still a member of that fraternity, and we are lucky enough to have youngsters coming to New Zealand to visit us, because once in a fraternity, always in a fraternity, and you basically have to house these youngsters at home and do the best for them that you can do. At the end of medicine, and Barry, you asked me what DCM means. At the end of medicine, we have to write a thesis. You don't get in Germany your MD automatically. You get it if you write an MD thesis, so the Americans have it a little bit easier here. I did cardiology. I thought cardiology is good. This is an elegant field. They all drive big cars and they just look at after one organ, very important organ. I thought, well, let's do cardiology. So it was good to start with. Of course, I did my thesis and I was able to present it in New Delhi, which was fantastic. So the first free conference trip to New Delhi, that was all good, and I obviously got my MD out of that. But then things went a little bit sour. I had to apply for jobs, and the time in Germany applying for jobs as a doctor was very difficult. Needless to say that maybe my grades were more influenced by being in a fraternity than concentrating on studies. But I wrote 80 applications. Can you imagine 80? So that was before the internet. So I didn't just hit a button and send an application off. These were bound applications, spiral bound applications. They were hugely expensive. Each individual application was hugely expensive. I started at the top, of course, going to universities, and they didn't like me. Local hospitals didn't like me. Rehab units didn't like me. But there was England. England had a shortage of doctors. So I went to England. Fantastic. Rob, where's Rob? Rob is somewhere here. I did nephrology. My first job was nephrology. And what I learned was it is very important to know what soccer club you belong to or what you're supporting. So the Saturday morning ward round was really divided between Man United and Manchester City. I did my first nephrology job in Manchester. And it's also interesting how the belonging to a soccer club and the support influences your perception of symptoms. When the game was on, it was dead quiet on the ward. Nobody called. As a house surgeon, I had 2 hours off. Nobody had any symptoms, but believe me, if the wrong club lost, gosh, the pager went berserk and everybody suddenly remembered why they were in hospital. That was an interesting time. We then went on to Greenwich District Hospital, did a little bit of cardiology, and then I dipped my toe into gastroenterology. And this is, I thought, the defining moment where I thought, this is my calling. And there was hope. There was hope for leaving England and possibly going back to Germany and actually doing gastroenterology. So as a trainee intern, I did a stint at Yale University. And funny how people perceive applications. So in my application was obviously a letter of recommendation from Yale University. Needless to say, without the American exam, I was absolutely unable to do anything at Yale University. I was like the 5th behind the professor and tried to see the patient. I was not allowed to touch any patients. I was not allowed to even really talk to a patient. But I had my letter of recommendation from Yale University. Who can beat that? And now to the title of my talk. Excuse me, where's the bathroom? Now, you can imagine we were sitting like this here, and I was sitting beside my German colleague who came with me to New Haven, and he whispered in my ear, do you know where the bathroom is? I said, I have no idea where the bathroom is. But then the guy behind us, Professor Boyers, Ulrich, he tipped us on the shoulder and said, hey, bathroom is over there. And we come, whoops, another one who speaks German. So he was a professor from Munich University, and he was on sabbatical at Yale University, and he knew where the bathroom is. So he became our friend. And as in my final year, when I had to kind of figure out my career and I went through these 80 applications, I said to Ulrich, hey, you're a professor in Munich, can you help me with a job? And he said, sure. I mean, you seem to be a nice guy. Send your CV to my boss, and I'm sure he can invite you to an interview. Took about 24 hours. I got my invitation back. Sorry, we have no job for you. So I went to Ulrich again and said, hey, you need to try better than that. This didn't work. And he said, yep, and there's a guy in Regensburg, Schiller. He does things a little bit differently. He doesn't just look for grades. He wants to talk, and he's nice. So I sent my application off to Professor Schiller, the guy down there, very German looking guy. And so he was. So I still call him Professor Schultz. I haven't moved on to the Jürgen stage, but Professor Schultz, in response to my application, sent me a book. He sent me a book about that big and said, Dr. Schultz, please read chapter 10. If you find chapter 10 interesting, call my secretary and arrange an interview. Needless to say, chapter 10 was the best chapter I ever read. I mean, there was nothing better than chapter 10. It had to do with interleukin 10, whatever that was. Interleukin 2, no idea. Mice, well, I thought I'd become a doctor, but nevertheless, look after mice. So I wrote him back and said, gosh, yeah, chapter 10, that's the one I was waiting for. So he invited me to an interview. And there we were talking about chapter 10. I by then had actually read chapter 10, and I did my homework, so I could answer questions to chapter 10. And he said, I don't have a job for you right now, which I thought, okay, here we go again. But he said, if you want to spend a couple of years in a theoretical institution, that's what he called it, so I wasn't quite sure what that meant, I can help you, and in 2 years you come back and you have a job here. So cut a long story short, he introduced me to Professor Balfour Sartor, who has been my mentor ever since. Balfour is a clinician scientist at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and Balfour is just the most fantastic mentor you can imagine. I had the pleasure of being there just a couple of weeks ago when he was given the American Gastroenterological Association Lifetime Mentoring Award. And that just shows you what kind of guy he is. When he mentors somebody, he knows how that's being done. So Balfour had written, and I shouldn't tell you all these secrets, but it stays in this room, I guess. Balfour had written an application to the American funding authorities. He sent me that application, said, Michael, you need to translate that into German. You send it to the German funding agencies. They wouldn't know I've submitted the same stuff to the Americans, and then we both get money. So that's what we did. I got to go to North Carolina and do research on inflammatory bowel disease. So just a small excursus on what is inflammatory bowel disease. Now, inflammatory bowel disease is one of those chronic disorders that affect people mainly in their young years. It is still not quite known where inflammatory bowel disease comes from. You probably know Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. So it is a multifaceted disease. It has several things that need to come into play. Luminal antigens, so the microbiome that Barry and Harlene mentioned. The immune response needs to be in the right mindset to cause inflammatory bowel disease. The patient needs to have a certain genetic background to develop this disease. And of course, the environment plays a huge role in all of this. So in order to study this, we left for America. My then girlfriend, now wife, and mother of my children, we set off to America, and we thought, oh, this sounds like a great idea. So inflammatory bowel disease, as I said, is Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. The main difference is ulcerative colitis, as the name suggests, can only affect the large intestine, whereas Crohn's disease can affect the patient from top to bottom. If you look at these juicy pictures up there, and this is prior to dinner, so I think I can still show them, Crohn's disease has a distinctive different look to it than ulcerative colitis. Crohn's disease gives you deep ulcerations and healthy inner lining beside these big ulcers, whereas ulcerative colitis, on the other hand, gives you a more uniform appearance, confluent inflammation. And under the microscope, they also look quite different, these two diseases. However, talking about science, talking about research, these diseases do actually affect the patient fairly similarly. They are not that different on treatment levels and patient levels. Full steam ahead. We started research. So this was my foot in the door with funding from two big funding organizations. We were able to do very nice studies. So Balfour's claim to fame is that he was the first who described that a mouse model susceptible to inflammatory bowel disease or to intestinal inflammation will not get such an inflammation if there's no microbiota, if the mouse is sterile. So this first paper, and he basically what he did was he collected animal models susceptible to inflammation and stuck them into a germ-free environment, and most of them did not get any inflammation. So this first paper here, can you actually see the mouse? Yes, you can. So this first paper here, I was a co-author on that because I was in the lab for like 6-8 weeks or so, showed that if you have the mouse in a germ-free environment, nothing really happens in terms of inflammation. But if the mouse gets moved out into we call that specific-free environment, specific pathogen-free environment, this basically means an environment outside the cage, so the mouse is susceptible to all sorts of bacteria. This mouse gets, within 12 weeks, massive inflammation. And you see this here. This is the inner lining of the large intestine of a mouse, very thin, very normal looking, whereas all this down here, this is massive inflammation. This is really a thickly swollen large intestine. And this is how these poor mice had to live. They lived like the bubble boy in a bubble. It's hugely labor intense and complication prone to raise a germ-free environment. This is something that is very difficult to do. So only very few places in the world have this environment where we can really claim that the mouse is absolutely sterile and germ-free. Now, my first paper that I published myself then, or where I did most of the work, was a little bit of an interesting one because I just told you that if the mouse is germ-free without any bacteria, the mouse will not get any inflammation. Well, Michael showed that if you keep the mouse long enough in a germ-free environment, the mouse will still get some inflammation. That needed a little bit of convincing, that needed a little bit of extra work to make sure that the mouse wasn't contaminated or anything like that. But in the end, we were able to convince even the most serious skeptic that, yes, there is an autoimmune component in the whole system. So eventually, if you just wait long enough, the mouse will get inflammation. Now, these mice are very important and very special mice. IL-10 knockout mice or IL-10 deficient mice, they lack interleukin-10. Well, that's not the secret, but interleukin-10 is an immunosuppressive cytokine. Ross Kemp is here somewhere. She will tell me off later on for being so simplistic, but after all, I'm just a clinician. So it's an immunosuppressive cytokine. If you take that away, the immune system will just go berserk and will create this inflammation. The same thing holds true for interleukin-2. Again, if you take that away, there will be lots of inflammation. So you see that the picture is not quite as nice as in the first paper. They do get inflammation, but not as much as other animals. But nevertheless, it was still proof of principle that our components that we thought that lead to inflammatory bowel disease are just important to kind of make this happen. Then in 1996, still in the States, we expected a child, Kimmy. I don't know if Kimmy is here. Hi to Sydney, Kimmy. And my traditional parents, as they were, and my wife's traditional parents said, you can't have a child if you're not married. So, well, get married. We got married in New York. It has the romantic atmosphere of a 1970s Winds office, I guess. So we had tiled walls halfway through the corridor. We got married on the 31st of December. The guy said, we need to be fast here. I need to be out here by 12 o'clock. Do you have anyone who wants to join? And said, yeah, this person. So within 30 seconds or so, it was all over and done with. And you see, it didn't impede on the work. Down there is Kimmy and me working ahead on an old Olivetti computer. And this study that came to fruition then within that time frame was probably the one that, again, formed my research interest the most. So if the microbiota is so important in creating inflammatory bowel disease, we should be able to manipulate the microflora and somehow manipulate the creation of inflammatory bowel disease. So at that point in time, probiotics were just first mentioned. We took a strain Lactobacillus plantarum 299V, don't ask me why it was named like that, and we did a whole bunch of experiments with these animals. So of course, the gold standard was you keep the animal in germ-free conditions, nothing will happen, the animal will not get inflammation. We're back to the IL-10 knockout mice then. If you take the animal out of the germ-free environment, it will get severe colitis. So that were our control experiments. We then moved on to move the germ-free into an SPF environment, again, severe colitis. But if we associated that moving out into the SPF environment with Lactobacillus plantarum. So as soon as these animals got out of their cage, we started feeding them Lactobacillus. The colitis was much less severe than it was before. So obviously there was some sort of preventative effect of feeding a probiotic to these very inflammatory bowel disease prone animals. Even more so if we took germ-free animals and mono-associated them with Lactobacillus, the effect was even much better. So they saw Lactobacillus still in their sterile environment. We moved them out and continued with Lactobacillus, and that gave them just a very mild colitis. So that was an interesting finding because for the first time we were able in mice to manipulate the intestinal flora and showed that this has flow-on effects on inflammatory bowel disease. That said, we had to move back to Regensburg, to Germany, because the funding ran out. And I thought, well, what works in mice must work in humans. We're not that different, so let's do the same trial in humans. Well, everybody who can read a Kaplan-Meier curve tells me that, no, this didn't really work. So what we took were patients with Crohn's disease active Crohn's disease, a flare-up of their Crohn's disease. We put these patients on steroids as per standard protocol, but we also added a lactobacillus to their diet or to their treatment, hoping that we can shorten the active disease or the interval of active disease, and hoping that we can keep them in remission longer, these patients. Needless to say, it just did not work. So all my enthusiasm was for nothing. We stopped the trial after about 10 patients because there was absolutely no difference in these patients. There went my initial enthusiasm, but another milestone was reached. And as you could see early on with Kimmy on my arm, and I'm hacking away on the computer, the family was roped in, and this is now Fiona, who's up there in the audience. And Fiona didn't know it at that time, and ethically, I'm not quite sure if she would have been capable of signing an informed consent form, but I'm sure her mum did with some reassurance. What we did was we thought, okay, we can manipulate the intestinal flora of mice by giving them a probiotic. Can we do that in humans? So we picked, I think, 6 women. We started treating them with a lactobacillus and stopped at the time of birth. And then we collected fecal samples from these newborn babies up to a certain length of time, and we're trying to find that particular lactobacillus that we fed the mums, whether that was in the baby. And needless to say, it was there. So the thought was at that time that the first contact with a microbiome for a newborn is through mum. So when you compare, and everybody who went to Gerald Tannock's symposium last week, there was plenty of evidence there. When you look at the microflora of a newborn baby, that resembles very much a mixture between a vaginal flora and a rectal flora of mum. If you do the same in a baby with C-section, yeah, well, the microflora resembles more the sterile hands of the physician, of the obstetrician, and of the table, the surrounding environment in the hospital. So clearly it is important that mum passes something on to the baby. So in these 6 months, we were able to, up to 2 years, find this particular lactobacillus that mum has seen and obviously has passed on to baby. We were very careful to make sure that baby wasn't exposed in any other means to that lactobacillus. The 3 babies that were born by C-section did not show any evidence of this lactobacillus. So that was a fantastic study. Thank you very much, Fiona, for helping with that study. It was a tremendous milestone. But like all these things, there is a carry to it. And this was the first contact. Little did I know that I will end up in this place. This was the first contact with the University of Otago. So the paper was published and an editorial was published by Professor Tannock. Now, as you can read the editorial, or at least part of it, he wasn't too impressed, I guess, Gerald. He said, although the results are tantalizing, perhaps attempts at influencing the composition of the gut microflora might be better directed at bifidobacteria. And obviously, Gerald works on bifidobacteria, so he had to put his claim into the sand. But at least we got an editorial out of it, and Gerald noticed that. And I had some very great conversations with Gerald later on when I joined the University of Otago. So that was absolutely fantastic. So that was a starting point. Now, Barry mentioned that we do something that's called habilitation, which then ends in a big word like Privatdozent, very German word. Yes, it is somewhat similar to a PhD. Essentially, your boss has to decide when you're ready to go for it. It's not a big consortium that makes that decision. The unwritten rule is you publish a number of papers, you have some funding available, and then you write up this thesis, which you can write up either as a cumulative thesis, just like here as well. So you put your papers in there, do an introduction, do a conclusion, and that's it. And this is what I did. I had my 6 papers that were well published and well cited. So that was the habilitation, and that was very useful for my few years that I spent in Regensburg. We had to get married again. Now, why was that? I thought, you know, as I said before, the atmosphere of a Vince office of the 70s should be enough. But no, it wasn't. The dream of a real marriage or real wedding in white and all the bells and whistles, we had to just give in to that. Lots of dollars that went in, but it was worth it. It was absolutely worth it. It was very, very good. So that happened 2 years back in Germany. It wasn't a white wedding because, of course, white, we weren't white anymore. We had 2 children, so we couldn't do the white wedding. So we did the yellow-white wedding, I think, the kind of off-white wedding, which was fantastic. Fast forward. Now, Dunedin. How did this happen with Dunedin? Now, it happened because an email reached me. Dr. Lübke, who is the guy down here in the middle, Dr. Lübke, also a German doctor, he knew Professor Schultz back in Germany, and the gastro department, I think that's possibly the fate of the gastro department, was once again looking for a colleague. So Dr. Lübke sent an email to the colleague and said, well, if you got somebody who wants to come to New Zealand, why don't you ask him to send a CV to New Zealand? I was the 3rd person who received that email. The first 2 said, nah, New Zealand, too far away, or too many family ties here in Germany. I don't want to go. But, well, I looked at my wife and I said, well, you know, we've tried it before. We've been away. We've been to the States. We've been to England. Why shouldn't we try New Zealand? And when then the university here said, come for a week to visit, well, Barry, I have to admit, I said, well, at least we get a week New Zealand out of this, whether we like the job or not. Again, little did we know that we came to a land of opportunity. Gastroenterologists in New Zealand, that's really a land of opportunity, a land where milk and honey flows from a gastroenterological point of view. Rob Walker, John Hyten, Jim Mann, Gerald Tannock, Grant Butt, Gil Barbizet over there, Ralph Lübke, Martin Schlupp. I couldn't find a picture of Stephanie Ferrand, endocrinologist in the hospital, so that's a proxy for Steph. All these people gave me such a warm welcome and believed in what I wanted to do, and it didn't seem as such a big step. Twice 12 hours flying, being absolutely naked. I think it was raining like crazy here, and yeah, Dunedin showed itself from the best side. Still, we liked it here. Why did I say land of opportunity? So after all these interviews, on the flight back, we looked at each other and said, same thing happened to me here as well today. We made an offer, or I got an offer of the job, and I said to my wife, hey, let's take this job. Why not? So, why is it a land of opportunity? Now, back to some serious stuff. New Zealand has one of the highest incidence of inflammatory bowel disease, the highest rate of inflammatory bowel disease worldwide, and it's still growing. So somebody who has an interest in inflammatory bowel disease, where else to go? This is fantastic. We have approximately 25,000 patients in New Zealand. This is work that I've done together with Kirsten Koppel, who is here in the audience, I believe. I saw her. Yes, there she is. It was trawling through many patient notes, and now these are all locked up under asbestos scare, but we apparently been told we can retrieve some of the notes back from the basement of the hospital, but needless to say, this curve is pointing up, so we will see more of these patients in the future. So that's a good starting point for the land of opportunity. We have a lot of unhappy patients. So shortly after I arrived, there was a questionnaire done in New Zealand about treatment and everything else. Well, 2/3 of all patients needed emergency care prior to their diagnosis. That should not happen. 25% of patients waited more than 5 years for a diagnosis. That should not happen. 50% of patients needed surgery. Now, Mark Thompson-Fawcett is up there, and we weekly almost have a discussion whether this is good or bad if you need surgery. I still maintain it's bad. Mark maintains it's good, but I think the verdict is still out there. 61% waited more than 6 months to see a specialist. All these things make very unhappy patients. Now, we're not alone in this world. The lower panel here, and you can read the numbers yourself, those are the results from the same European service. So they're not much better than what we do here in New Zealand. They have similar problems. We also have unhappy doctors. Going on with the theme of land of opportunity, in 1932, Beryl Crone described first the disease of Crohn's disease. And since then, not much really has happened. Lots of publications and everything, but for the patient, something that I can take back to my clinic, that's still difficult. You know these drugs, you in the audience, there are steroids out there. Now, steroids are still our main stem of treatment. Can you believe it? They were first around in 1955. We're still using steroids with all the side effects steroids have. They're vicious drugs. Of course, they're good for the patient because it brings them into remission. The symptoms go away. But what's the cost? We dabbled a little bit in nutrition. 1985, there was a hype of there must be a nutritional treatment to this disease. No, there isn't. At least there wasn't. And maybe now learning that nutrition is the biggest influencer of the microbiome, maybe we go back and revisit nutrition. But certainly at that point in time, no. Azathioprine, again, a drug that has plenty of benefits. It's a fantastic drug because it keeps patients in remission without steroids. It's an immunomodulator, so it isn't called immunosuppressive agent. That sounds very bad. It's an immunomodulator. But again, when I have to go through the list of potential side effects with my patients, needless to say that some patients just walk out the door and say, well, thanks, but no thanks. We're talking about lymphoma, which is a cancer of the blood system. We talk about skin cancer. Well, thank you. We have enough skin cancer in New Zealand. We don't need you to put me on a drug that gives me even more skin cancer. And that's a study we also published and showed that we were able to triple the rate of skin cancer in patients treated with this drug. So you have to have a good reason why you put patients on these drugs. Methotrexate, not much nicer. A bit of hope then in 1996, and were the first very directed medications coming on the market from Belgium, the so-called anti-TNF antibodies or biologicals. Those drugs are different to steroids. Steroids put a blanket on your immune system, but these biological drugs are very targeted to one thing in the immune system and take that one thing out. Similar to IL-10 and IL-2, TNF-alpha is one of those mediators of inflammation. If you block it, the inflammation goes away. At least that's the theory. So there were two of them. A little bit political here. It took New Zealand quite a while until these drugs were funded. In 2009, finally, our patients got access to these drugs. And then nothing. Since 2009, we had no further development in New Zealand for any further drugs. So again, unhappy doctors. I just put up there in 2015, Australia had some more drugs. In 2017, Australia had some more drugs. We have nothing. Well, if our patient cannot tolerate the drugs that we have available, if a patient loses the effect of those drugs, and my next slide will show you that this is actually quite a few, we have to turn to surgery. Now, you saw on my very first slide that I'm on Twitter, and I'm following quite a few people on Twitter, and I'm also following a group that's called Gutless and Glamorous. Gutless and Glamorous is a group of young women with a stoma bag. Now, they make the best of their situation, but I don't think that should be what we're aiming for. Of course, this is not the end of the world, but if you talk to a 15, 20, 25-year-old young woman who wants to plan a family, that potentially surgery will ruin these plans of having a family and it will play with your body image. This is not an easy thing to do, especially when this person then brings the newspaper and says, but these drugs are available in some other countries. Can we not just leave to Australia? And I have to say, yeah, yes, you might have to. A lot of drugs that we use are not 100% effective. This is a slide I borrowed from Professor Barclay in Christchurch, and what it basically shows is that you start your patients on these drugs, and the efficacy is here on this side. So the immunomodulators, azathioprine, for instance, reach something like 30% of efficacy. 30% of patients on these drugs will stay in remission for a long time. That's fantastic. If we use the biologicals, so this is the anti-TNF antibody biologicals that I talked about, we go over 60%. So that's, again, fantastic. 60% of our patients will reach remission. Over time, this will get less and less. So we put those two drugs together, it will still get less and less. And after about a year, only about half of our patients are still in remission. So that drug that worked very well in the beginning stops working. We call that a therapeutic gap. And this is, I think, where research needs to be directed at. How do you do research in New Zealand? Well, you need people. I already said I had patients, but you also need money. Going the traditional funding routes seems to be difficult, seems to be not very effective because the acceptance rate of the big applications is abysmal. So I thought, well, how can I capture the needs of my needs and the patient with one thing? So Barry mentioned we do a lot of commercial trials, and this gives our patients access to the latest medications. So all these drugs that are either not even available in Australia, but or already available in Australia or the United States or Europe, all these drugs need to be tested first. So we have now built up a big center for clinical trials, and thanks to my research nurses, Aroha and Marilee and Marie-Michelle and Christine Ho, IBD nurse, and Dawn, and who was I missing? Amelia. So there's a standby picture, a proxy for Amelia, because I couldn't find an Amelia picture. So all these nurses help me running these trials. Steve Johnson has joined the unit lately, 3 years ago, and he's also very busy in these clinical trials. And what they do is they allow my patients to have the latest in medications, and we have a lot of success stories, but they also pay quite handsomely these trials. So they pay for all our investigator-initiated trials. And you see here the yellow bars down here, the light yellow bars. These are the trials that we run where we use the money from these commercial trials to run these things. And one of those projects was a project that looked into the origin of inflammatory bowel disease, organoids. Now, what are organoids? I teamed up with Grant Butt, who had a long-standing history of working together with the gastro department, as well as Ross Kemp again, and Safina was our PhD student at that time. And we asked the initial question, the chicken and the egg question: is it a leaky gut that leads to inflammatory bowel disease? And if so, is the leaky gut there before inflammatory bowel disease happens, or will it be a consequence of inflammatory bowel disease? So the cause-consequence question. For that, we used patients with inflammatory bowel disease. We still do. We take a biopsy from their large intestine. We isolate the little crypts, that's the little subunits that the large intestine is made of, and we grow them in the lab. We grow out these crypts into little mini guts, and they're actually really mini guts in terms of they're representing all the cells that you would find in a normal large intestine. Positive point, they don't fart, but they grow and they get bigger. They have no immune system. They have no bacteria, so we can really go back to the origins of inflammatory bowel disease. What was there first? What was the first event that led to inflammatory bowel disease? Needless to say, they're all patient-specific, so we have now a freezer full of these little organoids from individual patients and can study the difference between patients, but also the difference with healthy beings. And we characterize them. So the top panel here is a normal biopsy of a large intestine, and needless to say what you see here, all these crypts and things, but it looks fairly similar to what grows in my freezer, or in my incubator rather. They get frozen and then they get thawed again. So they look very similar. So we are able to replicate a large intestine in the lab. An electron microscope picture up here compared with an organoid down here. So there is really a strong similarity between what we are growing in the lab and what is actually present in the patient. And that's obviously the first step to learn about these diseases, when you take all the other influencing factors away. But then the question was really, how does inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease develop? So the trigger, is there a trigger necessary? Our hypothesis, which proved wrong in the end, but our hypothesis was, without any trigger, without any immune system, these things are just the same. We need something to trigger inflammatory bowel disease. Boy, were we wrong. We saw straight away that even an uninflamed colon, Crohn's disease colon, the crypts look much different, these individual subunits here. And if you believe this graph here, the crypts in inflammatory bowel disease and Crohn's disease are much longer. They're edematous, they're inflamed. Naked eye, you don't need to be a molecular biologist or a clinician to see there's a big difference between these two. This is a control organoid, this is a Crohn's disease organoid. That looks really unhealthy. If we looked further into detail, electron microscopy, this picture you've seen before, a very nicely organized inner lining of the large intestine. Crohn's disease doesn't look like that. It looks really ill. It looks distorted. It looks just not healthy. And Safina could show that about 20% of those organoids grow inside out. So they've lost the orientation. They didn't know which way to grow. So suddenly the outside is inside and the inside is outside. Doesn't make any sense. But the fact is, we don't need bacteria to trigger inflammatory bowel disease. We don't even need an immune system, sorry to say. We just need a patient and the genetic background to make Crohn's disease. Going back to the question of leaky gut, well, yes, these things are leaky, again, without the influence of bacteria. So up here, you see an organoid, and we put color into the medium that was outside the organoid. The organoid was swimming in that medium. Nothing goes to the inside, so there was no leakiness. But if we take a Crohn's disease organoid, lots of leakiness. All the color leaked into the organoid. So again, a sign for the leaky gut is there. It's already there before Crohn's disease physically develops. So that was quite interesting. And this study in organoids showed us that changes are independent of the effects of bacteria and the immune system, suggesting that an increase in epithelial permeability is cause and not consequence of inflammation in Crohn's disease. Now we need to obviously confirm that, but that was a fantastic first finding. And then we moved on. There were unhappy patients. So the organoid story is for making, hopefully, doctors a bit more happy and finding new drugs. But then there are unhappy patients. So over a beer, Holger Bregenbrecht, who is sitting in the audience, and Tobias Langlotz, both from the Department of Information Sciences, Christian Ho, my inflammatory bowel disease nurse, and my postdoc, Andrew, we set out to do something about unhappy patients. Brandon Spiegel, a colleague of mine from Los Angeles, basically said in this little bit longer sentence here, we need to go where the patient is. We can't expect the patient to always come to us. We need to be more open to patients. We need to incorporate their lifestyle because we're working in the hospital, we're living in a hospital, patients don't. So the problem really is depicted in this flow chart here. If a patient has a flare-up, now this is my patient up here, this patient will call the IBD nurse. The IBD nurse will then put a little sticky note on my desk because she knows that I'm never at my desk, and I will read the sticky note, and I will put another sticky note on her sticky note to say what she's going to do with the patient. So she will then find her sticky note attached to my sticky note and call the patient back. The patient then possibly 3, 4, 5 days later will ring the IBD nurse again and say, well, actually, it did not really work. So by that time, the nurse comes back to me, possibly again with a sticky note, and the circle will go round and round and round. And this is just not good. Well, what did we do about it? We thought, let's take IBD Smart. Let's develop IBD Smart. That's an app, a smartphone application that Holger and his colleagues were helping us to develop. And that smartphone application should enable a patient to have a useful communication with us. So the patient can fill out the smartphone app, telling us all about the symptoms, telling us all about how they feel. There's a free text box in there, and this will come straight to my computer. So I have all the information I need about this patient's problem, and I can answer straight away. Some people make it more sophisticated. They have a nurse in between, and then there will be a red light coming up saying this patient is in deep trouble. A yellow, well, you can wake after the weekend. The patient will still be with us after the weekend. Or the green light, which says patient is fine, absolutely nothing to worry about. So this app, for the first time, allowed this very seamless communication between the patient and the healthcare professional. We tried this application in a nationwide study, so we talked to 3 other centers. We enrolled 100 patients. They were allocated to either the face-to-face trial, which means you carry on and talk to your doctor as per usual. Every 3 months, you sit down with Dr. Mangianata and have a chat with Dr. Mangianata, who is another colleague of mine here in the audience, or you just fill out Michael's app, and Michael will get an email with the results, and Michael will respond back. All of these healthcare interventions are only as good as, well, first of all, the acceptance, and second, the outcome. Will, after a year of not seeing me, a patient be as healthy as before? Have I missed anything by having the patient just filling out the app? Is the patient then needing to go to hospital because I missed a flare-up or anything like that? So we tried all this over a 12-month trial, as I said, face-to-face versus IBD Smart, and we had our readouts. These are disease severity indices, and we looked at what happened after a year. Now, we had 100 patients, that's a reasonable number, and you see there was no difference. This was a non-inferiority trial, so we don't have any p-values here, but you see the patients with ulcerative colitis fared the same after a year, throughout the year. Crohn's disease, it tried to separate a little bit, but in the end it came back together, and this is the most important one. IBDQ is quality of life. How did the patient perceive their quality of life? And this was absolutely similar. So by doing that, we were able to prove that using the smartphone app, we can deliver the same level and the same quality of care than face-to-face, but possibly much easier for all parties concerned. The patient can be anywhere, and we can do this. So we now have this application out in the public, and cannot be downloaded from the App Store because of various reasons. The App Store doesn't play ball with us, but we make this app available to all patients that want it and hope that we can improve the care for these patients. Now, I'm coming to the end of my talk, and I'm almost running out of time here. 2019, 2018, we did another survey, and somehow we have not achieved very much in the world of inflammatory bowel disease. 34% of patients still worry about cleanliness and sanitation when they travel around the country, and 65%, coming back to where's the next bathroom, worry about toilet facilities. So patients, when they start traveling with this disease, they still worried about where will I end up? Will I be able to use the facilities that are available? They obviously have lots of other concerns. Crohn's and Colitis in New Zealand came up with this little card. So if these patients have an urgent business to do, they can show this card. But you know how difficult it is to talk about this. Who will go up to strangers and said, I'm about to, can I please jump the queue? This is still something we need to work on. So, in summary, there's still so much to do. So much to do in terms of the answer of inflammatory bowel disease might be in the intestinal microbiome, but then probiotics didn't work. Did I use the wrong ones? Did I use the wrong patients? Who knows? We need personalized medicine, combining all we know. This is not a one-size-fits-all disease. This is very individualized. So we need to work on our organoids to make sure that each patient gets the best medication that is available for this particular patient. Until then, I guess it's on their terms, on my patient's terms, and not on our terms, to help them getting through this difficult time. And we try to reach out with IBD Smart. I had lots of fun doing this. You see, I'm really passionate. My wife will say you forgot to breathe when you talked. Yes, I say that's my enthusiasm, but it's probably true a little bit about both. So I was president of the Society of Gastroenterology until last year, and we do a themed night. So I think I'm doing a very pretty Princess Leia down here. The last conference here in Dunedin, we had the sextet involved, and gosh, they rocked the place. It was in the stadium. It was absolutely fantastic. So, yeah, it is fun doing gastroenterology. We do wacky things. You probably all read about the study we did going to the Mungal mob and tested them for hepatitis C. That got me slightly out of my comfort zone. They are intimidating, but nice, after all. And I still know them, and we still talk. So that's fantastic. And the way this came about was one of our students comes from a mob family, from a Mungal mob family. And we talked about this, and he opened the door and said, this is Uncle Ed. You can talk to Uncle. I said, okay. Hi, Uncle. Was fascinating. We went through 3 centers in New Zealand, and we tested about 50 mobsters. So that was really an exciting thing. I went to Samoa to teach gastroenterology, and then obviously I connected with my patients. That's the Crohn's and Colitis Children's Camp. Yeah, the exercise we had to do on the circle training was really difficult. There's a nice YouTube video of me sinking down in mud, and it was a fantastic time. But seeing these kids now to address me not as a doctor, but as Michael, and we talk about these things on a different level, makes it just worthwhile. It's absolutely amazing. So, I told you I've got a funny picture of you. Coming to the thank you part, my wife had to live through all this. She had to not only be treated with lactobacillus, but she had to travel the world with me to just fulfill my dreams. And I often say my children don't study medicine. Why do they not? I was never home to tell them how great this job is, so probably that's what I missed. But my wife stood behind me and pushed me forwards, probably. She was really instrumental to all of this. So Heike, thank you very much. And you don't need to come down, and I don't throw them up here, but they are for you. Kimmy, I still don't know whether she, oops, no, that's the wrong direction. I don't know whether Kimmy is online, but Kimmy, Sydney, enjoy Sydney. This is such a fantastic place, and Dad keeps paying for you. And then we have Fiona in the room, and as Harleen said, yes, the whole family is somehow connected to the University of Otago. Fee, yes, you did fantastic with a dad who was never home, with a dad who did lots of research, with a dad who had these yucky topics at dinner table, who told you about what did dad do throughout the day. These are for you. Take them to Unicol. I know you enjoy Unicol, and that's just fantastic. And then there's somebody in the family who just doesn't give a toss about anything. She just enjoys life. And these are the people I'd like to thank. I don't go through this list, and please don't come to me and say, hey, you've forgotten me, or hey, you've forgotten that. I put etc. down there. So there are many more people I have to thank for all that great work I was able to do. And of course, I have to thank the gastro unit in the hospital, because they are at the receiving end and they need to take biopsies and they need to have patients distracted because they need to fill out questionnaires and all sorts of things. Fantastic guys for allowing me to do that. And my patients, there are some patients here in the room. Thank you so much for coming. I hope that my research contributes a little bit to your well-being. And thank you so much again also for doing all the things I'm asking you to do. Going home with packs of questionnaires, giving yet another blood sample, and answering another phone call. Thank you so much.
Kia ora, tēnā tātou koutou. My name's Paul Brunton and I have the privilege of being the Pro Vice Chancellor for Health Sciences. These are always enjoyable occasions, but they are so enjoyable when you hear from somebody who's so passionate about their research. So we heard about a journey in research, peppered with 2 beautiful children and 2 weddings along the way. We also heard about research of real impact and benefit to patients, all against the backdrop of clinical practice, which I know how challenging that can be to bring it all together. So an impressive achievement and a wonderful lecture. So congratulations, Michael. And we do have a small gift hidden away that I'm going to present to you on our behalf to thank you formally. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
I would also like to thank you, our audience, for coming along. The university puts a lot on these occasions. They're very special celebrations here at the University of Otago when somebody becomes a professor, and we're grateful that you turned out on a rather cool night to be part of this very special occasion tonight. I close by asking you to join us for some refreshments in the staff club. Please come along, talk to Michael about his research, and enjoy the rest of your evening. But before we disappear, can we thank our speaker again in the usual way? Thank you very much indeed.